Shop the Sherwin-Williams Memorial Day sale and get 30% off paints and stains May 16th through the 26th. With prices starting at $34.29, it's the perfect time to transform your space with color. Whether you're looking to revamp your bedroom, living room, or home office, we have you covered with bold hues, soothing neutrals, and everything in between. Shop the sale online or visit your neighborhood Sherwin-Williams store. Click the banner to learn more. Retail sales only. Some exclusions apply. See store for details.
You're listening to Campus Killings, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, DNA ID, Zodiac Speaking, Scene of the Crime, Missing Persons, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, and Citizen Detective. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
Hi, Megan, and welcome back, listeners. Today's case takes us to Scotland and the Royal College of Surgeons. Our focus today is on the well-known anatomy lecturer, Dr. Robert Knox. While he wasn't actually a professor with the Royal College of Surgeons, he was one of the most well-known anatomists of the 1820s, and he ran the Museum of Anatomy at the college, as well as being an intrinsic part of setting up the Royal College's anatomy major in 1822. And he was one of the premier experts and was exceedingly popular with students. But before we dive into Dr. Knox, let's take a look at the college that he worked for. And this is probably one of our oldest colleges that we've covered. Chartered in 1505, the Royal College of Surgeons has been in constant operation for over 600 years, and it is the oldest surgical college in the world.
Did not know. Good job. Surprise. Okay.
Originally known as the Guild of Barbers and Surgeons, the organization sought exclusive rights on the ability to perform surgeries under the laws that all apprentices needed to be literate and to go through a rigorous testing process at the end of their apprenticeship to ensure that they were withholding the surgical standards of their mentors. Now, this was pretty groundbreaking for the 1500s, since the majority of the population was illiterate, and essentially anyone who apprenticed with a barber could also be considered a surgeon. So barbers often perform basic surgery with little education.
That's incredible. That's very cool.
Yeah. The school's first building was erected in 1697 and was known as Surgeons' Hall, which contained a lecture hall, a laboratory, a library, and a surgical theater where students watched live cadaver dissections.
Oh, what?
Interestingly, once a year, these dissections were open to the public for anybody who wanted to watch. By 1778, King George III granted the Guild a new charter that allowed them to change their name to the Royal College of Surgery. The school began to grow exponentially in the 18th and early 19th century as more public interest was placed on safe surgical methods. New buildings also started popping up in the 1830s to accommodate the growth, and major medical breakthroughs were made during the next 50 years. In fact, in 2005, the college celebrated its 500-year anniversary with the opening of several new buildings to accommodate its still growing numbers. As of 2014, the college had a global network of over 32,000 active graduates working in the field of surgery across 140 countries. It is still one of the most renowned surgical colleges and also now has a satellite campus in Malaysia. But at the start of this legacy was a man who would unfortunately become infamous. Dr. Robert Knox began his medical career at the University of Edinburgh in 1810, where he took classes with the then famous anatomist Dr. John Barclay. Now, Barclay was considered the best anatomy teacher in Britain, and much of his research and teachings provided the foundation for the anatomy that we know today. And young Robert was very inspired by his teacher, and upon his graduation in 1814, Robert put his theoretical education to practice, taking a year to study at St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London. From there, Robert joined the British Army as a hospital assistant, where he was deployed to treat the wounded coming out of the Battle of Waterloo. It became clear to him during this time that because so many of the military hospital staff lacked anatomical knowledge, most of the surgeries ended in the death of the patient, and he hoped that someday he would remedy this by making anatomy a larger part of the surgical curriculum. In 1822, he left the army and returned to Scotland, where he was inducted as a fellow into the Royal Society of Edinburgh, which is a national academy for science and letters. With this position, Robert petitioned the Royal College of Surgeons to allow him to open a museum of comparative anatomy. He then became the college's official curator in 1825, and that same year, his old professor, John Barclay, also offered him a partnership to do anatomical lectures at the Royal College's dissection theater as a private tutor. Of course, Robert accepted, and only a year later, he ended up taking over all of Dr. Barclay's classes because Barclay became too sick to teach.
Okay. You said he was a museum curator?
Yeah.
Oh, so
And
that was
he was
really...
also a lecturer.
Wow. So he's got a very interesting, diverse career built around anatomy.
Yeah. Yep. And over the next 2 years, Robert became one of the most beloved tutors at the Royal College, and by 1827, Robert's lectures and lab were so popular that he had to take on 5 assistants just to handle the load.
Wow.
However, there was one very difficult part of his job: procuring enough cadavers to dissect in front of the hundreds of students who were clamoring to get into his operating theater. While anatomists of the 1800s understood the importance of knowing the internal workings of the human body before cutting into it, most of the public found surgeons to be butchers and thought that their use of cadavers for medical education to be barbaric. To this end, the only legal way that Robert and his fellow anatomists could get fresh cadavers for study was to wait for criminals to be executed.
Oh. So I guess nobody was donating.
Yes. And somewhat surprisingly, in Robert's time, the rate of execution was fairly low at only 1 to 4 hangings per year. And while this might be good from a criminal justice or a humanitarian point of view, this was very bad for the 9 anatomy labs that were vying for cadavers.
I was going to point out that from our field, that's actually a positive or progressive for the time. But yes, okay, understood.
So unfortunately, this lack of cadavers would lead to a large amount of illegal activity on the part of the schools. Between the 1790s and the 1820s, body snatching became an enormous problem in Britain, Scotland, and the U.S., as medical colleges would often pay professional resurrectionists to dig up bodies from graveyards for the operating theaters.
Wow. That is not something I would have guessed.
Nope. And these men often worked for cemeteries, or they were hired specifically by the schools for the purpose of finding recently buried bodies to resurrect.
Whoa.
And the schools paid very well, sometimes as much as several months' wages for one cadaver. And when no resurrectionists were available, schools also sent medical students to the morgue to pay off undertakers for unclaimed bodies.
Whoa. I mean, I've never heard it. This is all new to you, right? Like, you didn't know any of this.
I mean, I've heard of body snatchers before.
Right.
I always thought that grave diggers were looking to sell body parts on the black market. I didn't realize it was used for medical school cadavers.
Okay, yeah. I've never thought about that with gravediggers, just so you know.
Okay, me neither.
Okay, good.
Body snatching was so prevalent in the early 1800s that wealthy citizens actually paid men to stand guard over their recently deceased relatives so that their bodies would not be stolen.
Oh my goodness.
Get this, Megan. Other methods to stop snatching included building iron cages over new graves, weighing coffins down with stones so that they couldn't be easily brought up, and installing tripwires attached to guns around the grave. It's like booby trapping.
Unbelievable. Wow. Okay. Who knew?
While it's unclear how well these deterrents work, most body snatchers weren't interested in the wealthy's deceased. Instead, they focused on what is known as potter fields, which was where the poor were buried in unmarked graves.
So is that because it's just easier?
It sounds, and probably cheaper.
Yeah, okay.
And the fresher the cadaver, the more the schools paid. So most snatchers had less than a 24-hour window to unearth the body and get it to the medical school if they wanted to be paid well. Embalming was not yet common practice at this time. As barbaric as this practice may seem to us, and it was certainly seen that way in the 1820s, there was a much larger issue on the horizon.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
On the night of November 30th, 1827, 2 men appeared at Dr. Knox's laboratory in Surgeon Square with a fresh body to sell. Robert didn't know them, and by all accounts, he normally left the buying of cadavers to 2 of his assistants. However, on this particular night, he happened to be there, and he agreed to pay £7, 10 shillings, since the cadaver was under 24 hours old. And this would be about $1,000 in today's money.
Okay. I was trying to figure that out. All right.
Yeah. The doctor took the cadaver to be used the following day for his lecture, and the 2 men left. Over the course of the next year, these two men returned every few weeks with fresh cadavers, and Robert's assistants paid between 8 to 10 Scottish pounds, between 1,200 and 2,000 in today's money, for each of these cadavers.
I suddenly just realized I think I know where this story is going. Okay,
Yes.
then. All right.
If Robert was curious about where these men kept finding such fresh specimens, there's no account of it, but the fact that he hadn't asked wasn't strange for the times. As everyone involved knew body snatching was illegal, no questions were ever asked about where the bodies were coming from. So it's one of these don't ask, don't tells.
Mm-hmm.
Money exchanged hands, the cadavers were brought to the college's surgical theaters, and medical progress was made. But this would all come to a screeching halt in November of 1828 when police came knocking on Robert's laboratory door looking for the corpse of a murdered woman. Much to Robert's surprise, the cadaver on his table was the woman in question, and it had been sold to him by the two men who had been his main supplier. Robert Knox had been complicit in a murder. But who were these murderers? The men in question, named William Burke and William Hare, were both originally from Ireland. Burke emigrated to Scotland in 1818, where he found himself alone in a new country, and he became a day laborer working on the Union Canal project. About a year later, he met and married a woman named Helen Nellie McDougall, and they lived together for about 10 years before they relocated to Edinburgh, where Burke went door to door as a cobbler, which is also basically just a shoe repairman.
Mm-hmm.
And he was good at his job. He was described as outgoing and charming, and he was literate in a time when most laborers were not. However, the pay as a cobbler was not steady, so in 1827, Burke went to a local farming village to work as a day laborer, bringing in the harvest. As he worked, he met another Irish immigrant who had also relocated to the area, and this would be William Hare. Little is known about Hare's background, other than that he had emigrated to be a laborer and he had spent some time as a fish seller. At the time of the men's meeting, Hare and his wife Margaret owned a boarding house back in Edinburgh, but the boarders didn't always pay their rent. So because of this, Hare was working in the fields to make extra money for the family. These two men struck up a friendship, and when the harvest had come to an end, Burke and Helen moved into Hare's boarding home. The two couples became fast friends, and they were known for heavy drinking and boisterous behavior. A few months into this friendship, one of Hare's boarders died unexpectedly on November 29th of 1827. And this particular boarder owed back rent to Hare, and it was the equivalent of about $600 in today's money. So Hare complained to Burke about being out so much rent money. This is a lot of money that he was out.
Mm-hmm.
It's unknown who actually made the first suggestion, but after some conversation, the men decided to try and sell the boarder's body to the Royal College to make up for the missed rent. Now, this particular boarder had no family, and as far as they knew, his coffin had been paid for by the Catholic parish. So it wasn't very difficult for Burke and Hare to fill the coffin with rubbish and then, under the cover of darkness, transport the boarder's body by covered wheelbarrow to the Royal College of Surgery, where one of Robert Knox's students directed them to his lab in Surgeon Square.
Okay.
Upon receiving almost double what Hare was owed in back rent, the two men realized that there was a lot of money to be made in selling of cadavers.
Mm-hmm. And here's where the idea is born.
Mm-hmm. And the problem became that boarders dying without paying the rent didn't really happen often enough to be a revenue stream.
Right.
But Burke and Hare would change that in January of 1828. While it is unknown exactly who their first victim was, since both men were usually very drunk when the murders took place, most agree that a grain miller named Joseph was the first to succumb to Burke and Hare. Joseph was boarding with the Hares, and he ended up getting sick with the flu at some point in January of 1828. As Margaret Hare didn't want him spreading the highly contagious disease, which at the time in the 1800s was deadly, she was also worried that boarders would leave if they found out that he was sick. So Hare and Burke decided that they would kill him and sell his body.
Okay. Clearly the next rational step.
Yeah, for them it was.
Right.
One night they went to Joseph's room and gave him whiskey as a ploy of helping him feel better. And when he was sufficiently drunk, the men suffocated Joseph with a pillow. They then wheelbarrowed his body to Dr. Knox's laboratory, where his assistant paid them £10, which is about $2,000 in today's money. The men felt that they'd stumbled on a gold mine, and the next victim was a traveling salesman who fell ill at the boarding house a few weeks later. Once again, Burke and Hare gave the man whiskey to help him feel better. They then suffocated him when he was too drunk to fight back.
Amy, neither of these people had committed murder on their own first, right? I mean, they had some criminal history, but I assume these murders together, from what we know, they haven't committed murders before.
From what we know, of course, it was so long ago that there's not so many records, right?
That's true. Yeah, there's no
like...
official report. Okay. All right, fair.
But yes, but as far as what we know, he too was taken by wheelbarrow to Dr. Knox's lab, where his assistants paid Burke and Hare, and they took the body for dissection. Due to the suffocation method that Burke and Hare used, there was no damage to the body, and in a time before modern forensics, it was undetectable as murder. So the anatomists really had no indication that the bodies they were paying for hadn't died of illness or other natural causes.
Right.
Burke and Hare waited patiently for the next lodger to fall sick, but several weeks passed and nobody got ill.
This is when they have to, now it's no longer, they don't need someone to be sick, right? Now they're just going to kill people.
Now they're innovating.
Yes, innovating, okay.
So for them, the gold mine had dried up and they needed a new way to get high-quality cadavers without being caught. So they decided to go to the streets where poverty was rampant and desperate people were easily lured to a warm bed and a hot meal.
Right.
So preying on vulnerable victims.
Yep.
We'll return after a brief word from our sponsors.
The first of their street victims was a young salt seller named Abigail Simpson. Hare invited her to the boarding house for a hot meal where he served her copious amounts of alcohol. Once she was too drunk to leave, he offered her a room for the night, and then he and Burke suffocated her after she fell asleep. In later testimony, Burke mentioned that Dr. Knox approved of it being so fresh when he and Hare brought Abigail's body to the lab. This process worked again in early April of 1828, when Burke met two women who he took out to a tavern one morning before inviting them back to the Hare's boarding house for breakfast. But on the way, instead of going to the boarding house, they ended up in the kitchen of Burke's brother. There, Burke and the two women drank several bottles of whiskey, and one of the women, Mary Patterson, fell asleep drunk on the table. Burke kept talking to the other woman until his wife Helen showed up and scared the woman away. Helen accused Burke of having an affair, and the other woman quickly left to avoid any confrontation. But Helen was so angry, she went and she got the Hares to bring the drunk Burke back home. However, once William Hare arrived and saw the passed-out Mary Patterson on the table, he decided that she would be their next victim. The men locked their wives out of the kitchen and smothered Mary Patterson. They then removed her clothes and put her in an empty tea chest that they found in the kitchen, and then they transported her to Robert Knox. By all accounts, when Robert's assistants took the body, Mary was still warm, and this caused the assistants to become a little suspicious.
Right.
The assistant asked exactly where Burke and Hare had gotten a cadaver so fresh that it wasn't even cold, to which they replied that the woman had drunk herself to death and they paid for her body as they immediately thought of Dr. Knox. No further inquiries were made, and the assistant produced a 10-pound note for Burke and Hare. Only 2 weeks later, one of Hare's female tenants, an older woman only known as Miss Haldane, got drunk and fell asleep in the Hare's stable. She was quickly smothered by the men and again brought to Dr. Knox. And about 2 weeks after that, Miss Haldane's daughter began lodging at the Hares. She enjoyed staying up late to drink with Burke, and one night Burke got her exceptionally drunk and suffocated her on the boarding house table. Again, he brought her body to Dr. Knox, and he was given 8 pounds.
Somebody's going to catch on to this racket soon. I mean, this is unbelievable.
Yes, and as you could imagine, this will all come crashing down at some point.
It has to. It's too egregious.
This trend would continue throughout the spring and summer of 1828, where Burke and Hare either lured victims, who at this point were mostly single, impoverished women, back to the boarding house, or they found them already drunk on the street and brought them to Hare's stable to suffocate them and then sell them to Dr. Knox. Among the long list, their victims included a washerwoman, a young woman who'd sold scrap leather to Burke for his cobbler business, an old woman and her grandson, an unknown woman who Hare murdered by himself, and even one of Burke's own relatives, someone who had come to the boarding house to visit his wife.
Wow.
And all of these bodies and more were taken to Dr. Knox, where his assistants continued to pay the hefty fee of 8 or 10 pounds per cadaver. However, their next victim would begin to raise suspicions at the Royal College of Surgery. The murderers went after a local beggar named Daft Jamie, who was a well-known figure around the streets of Edinburgh. You see, Jamie had deformed feet, which caused him to limp, and he was also mentally disabled. If not actually liked, Jamie was warmly tolerated by the people in the area, and due to his limp, he was easily spotted panhandling on street corners. It's unclear why Burke and Hare selected him, but perhaps it was because they thought he'd be an easy target due to his limp and mental issues.
Right.
Either way, they did their usual routine of luring the young man to the boarding house for a hot meal and then giving him alcohol. The only issue was Jamie didn't really like alcohol. He preferred snuff, which was a type of tobacco. So he was not as drunk as Burke and Hare expected when they went to kill him. And Jamie fought back. But unfortunately, he wasn't strong enough to fight off the two grown men, and he succumbed to Hare's suffocation. Like all the others, his body was delivered to Dr. Knox like all the others had. But this time, when Dr. Knox put the body on the dissection table, several of the students commented that it looked just like Daft Jamie. Robert didn't believe this was the case, but the next day, Jamie's mother and sisters reported him missing, and nobody knew where he had gone. The fact that the cadaver in Robert's lab had the same foot deformities as Daft Jamie made him nervous, and before the official dissection in the college theater, Robert had the cadaver's feet and head removed.
Whoa.
This act would later incriminate Robert Knox, especially because he accepted yet another body from Burke and Hare around 3 weeks later.
Ugh.
In October of 1828, Burke and Hare had a bit of a falling out, and Burke was staying at a different boarding house, a much smaller one with only 2 rooms, one that Burke and his wife Helen were occupying, and another housing a family named the Greys. On the evening of October 31st, Burke lured an Irish woman named Margaret Daughtry off the street with some liquor, and the two drank the evening away. Burke then paid the Grey family to move over to Hare's boarding house under the guise that Margaret was a relative of his wife's and he wanted her to stay the night with them. The Greys agreed, but returned to the small boarding house around 9 p.m. that night because they had forgotten some clothing. At this time, they saw Burke, Hare, their wives, and Margaret Daughtry still drinking in the kitchen. They got their clothing and went back to Hare's for the night. But when they returned in the morning, they became suspicious when Burke wouldn't let them go back in their room. He told them Margaret was sleeping off drinking, but something just didn't feel right to them. After Burke had left the boarding house, they went up to their room and found a large pile of straw at the end of their bed. And underneath the straw was the body of Margaret, and she had blood and saliva pooling at the sides of her mouth.
Whoa.
The Greys immediately went to the police. But by the time officers were dispatched to the boarding house, Burke and Hare had sold Margaret's body to Dr. Knox.
Oh, my goodness.
Luckily for the police, several witnesses had seen Burke and Hare knocking on Dr. Knox's lab that morning, and it did not take long for the officers to raid the anatomy lab and find Margaret's body. Burke, Hare, and both of their wives were arrested for murder, and during interrogation, Burke and Hare turned on each other.
Oh,
Are you surprised?
No surprise there. I was going to ask about their wives earlier. I just assumed the wives had to be in on some of this. You know, they locked them out of the kitchen and smothered them. And I don't mean in on it like they did it, but it seemed like they had to know something.
Well, actually, they were eventually set free because there was no proof that they knew what their husbands were doing.
Sure, but maybe they didn't, that does not
yeah.
mean that they did not know. And we know that prosecution of women was very different then as well.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
Now, again, the two men turned on each other, but unfortunately for prosecutors, Burke and Hare had very little evidence of their murder spree. The only evidence in question was the clothes that they had taken off Mary Patterson, but that was not enough to pin the rest of the murders on them. So the prosecutors offered Hare a deal in which he would get full immunity if he confessed and indicted Burke.
What?
And Hare fully obliged, and a speedy trial began on Christmas Eve of 1828. While Hare admitted that over the course of the year, he and Burke had killed 3 men, 12 women, and 1 child, Burke was only charged with 3 murders, that of Margaret, Mary Patterson, and Daft Jamie.
A child, too? Oh, yeah.
Based on the confession Hare provided in court, along with the evidence of Mary Patterson's clothing and Margaret's body being found in Robert Knox's lab, Burke was found guilty and sentenced to death. Just a month later, on January 28, 1829, Burke was hanged in a public spectacle attended by over 25,000 people. Ironically, his body was given to the Royal College of Surgeons, and after dissection, his skeleton was put on display in Robert Knox's museum in Surgeons Hall.
Oh, my gosh. What happened to Knox? Are you going to talk about...
Wait, hold on.
All right.
You could still go there today and see the skeleton.
That is pretty ironic.
Isn't that crazy? And we'll get to Robert Knox in just a minute.
All right.
And while Hare had been a full participant in the murders, due to his deal with the prosecution, he was released from prison in February of 1829. However, though he escaped to England, his reputation followed him, and according to some reports, he was thrown into a quarry by an angry mob and was blinded. Reports say that he spent the rest of his life as a beggar in London.
Interesting.
Okay, so you asked about Robert Knox.
Yes.
Now, there was public outcry that he too should be criminally charged as he accepted and paid for the bodies of 16 murdered people. Not to mention, he simply disfigured Daft Jamie when his students recognized the body instead of going to the authorities.
Yeah.
But due to the fact that his assistants had been the ones to accept the bodies, and the 16 that he had received from Burke and Hare were only a quarter of the 100 bodies a year that he accepted for the surgical theater, Dr. Knox was never criminally prosecuted.
Yeah. I had a feeling that was going to happen. I wonder if his reputation was tarnished. Was the school? Was he fired?
Yes.
I mean, maybe we don't know any of that, or maybe we know all of that, but I wonder if there were informal sanctions that he suffered.
Oh, there certainly were informal sanctions. Also, I want to tell you that Burke made a public confession to the court that Dr. Knox had never encouraged him or Hare to kill anyone or to even bring him more bodies. His assistants just paid them as they would any other person who came to the door with a cadaver.
Okay.
So as far as the medical establishment and the law was concerned, Dr. Knox had sadly drawn the short straw in the body-snatching business, but he wasn't any more guilty than the rest of the anatomists at the college who accepted bodies without origin. But despite being lawfully innocent, the public felt that he was guilty.
Oh, okay.
So as you mentioned, there were a lot of informal sanctions. He received death threats, and mobs of people rioted outside of his house and his lab.
Oh, wow.
And fearing future violence towards the college, the administration pressured Robert to resign, which he did in 1831.
I had a feeling that was coming. Yeah, okay.
He continued to lecture around Scotland until he moved to England in 1847, where he wrote for medical journals before being appointed as the chief pathological anatomist of the Free Cancer Hospital of Britain in 1851.
Oh, wow.
Despite his continued success, Robert Knox was never able to fully shake his involvement with the Burke and Hare murders, and its grisly legacy followed him wherever he went. There was even an awful children's poem that was written about his complicitness in the murders. However, a silver lining came from the murder spree and Robert's involvement. The Burke and Hare trial blew the lid off of the underground cadaver industry and forced policymakers to contend with the fact that limiting anatomists to waiting for criminals to be executed had not been working. Several proposals to change the law had actually been brought to Parliament in 1827 and 1828, but they had been rejected. However, after Burke and Hare, the laws were quickly changed and the Anatomy Act of 1832 was passed. And essentially, this authorized anatomists to use the bodies of unclaimed workhouse employees for dissection. In addition, it allowed private persons to donate their bodies to science upon their death.
Ah, yes. Okay. Right.
So by 1833, the body-snatching era had pretty much ended, and cadavers were legally and readily available for medical progress.
Okay.
16 people lost their lives at the hands of Burke and Hare, and it's very possible that these victims were not the only ones who ended up on the operating tables of men like Dr. Robert Knox. Likewise, Burke and Hare may not have been the only murderers who made money in the underground cadaver trade. They were simply the ones who got caught. But in a way, their crimes changed an entire academic industry, leading to more ethical policies and a safer world. Now, we don't really know the names or the stories of all the victims of the body-snatching era, but their lasting legacy is certainly in the Anatomy Act of 1832. And there were many medical advancements that were made possible by these ethical changes.
I would have never known about an era of body snatching had it not been for this case. I'm sitting here. I'm still a little bit shocked by this case. I guess I should have been a little bit more enlightened on this topic. Very glad to hear in the end something positive at least came from this, and there were at least some positive developments, because a lot of innocent people lost their lives for seemingly not much. So
yes.
Yeah.
And I also I learned actually a lot in this story also, because I like when we do these historical cases.
Oh, yeah.
Because it was very surprising to me how few people were put to death. I was under the impression that a lot of people were losing their lives for entertainment for people in, the 1800s.
Right. Yeah. No, definitely learned a little bit. We learned a little bit science-wise here, anatomy-wise here, college-wise. Yeah. And of course, we learned a little bit about criminology, which we like.
Yes. Before we go today, if you'd like to support Campus Killings, consider subscribing to the show with an AbJack Insider subscription through Apple Podcasts.
Your subscription will get you VIP access to all the shows on the network that not only includes hundreds of episodes of ad-free listening, but also bonus content and early access to episodes
For only $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year, you'll unlock a variety of listener benefits, and you'll be supporting this show in the process.
Head over to Apple Podcasts and search for either Campus Killings or AbJack, and you can start your subscription with a free trial.
Your support is greatly appreciated.
Thank you, everyone, for listening today, and we hope you'll join us on the next episode of Campus Killings.
Campus Killings is hosted by Dr. Megan Sachs and Dr. Amy Schlossberg, with research and writing by Abigail Belcastro. It's produced by Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to follow Campus Killings on social media. You can find Campus Killings on Twitter with the handle @CampusKillings or on Facebook at facebook.com/CampusKillings. You can also visit the show's homepage at campuskillings.com. Be sure to tune in every other Saturday for new episodes of Campus Killings.